A record 10th speech by a French president before a joint session of the U.S. Congress, a speech where Emmanuel Macron played the history card to the hilt.
The story of France and the United States is a story of an endless dialogue, made of common dreams, of a common struggle for dignity and progress. It is the best achievement of our democratic principles and values. This is this very special relationship. This is us.
Very special relationship as Brexit nears. Emmanuel Macron firmly establishing France as the nation worthy of that special relationship with Washington. We'll review a speech where Macron did go beyond niceties, spelling out differences on trade, the environment, urging Donald Trump's America to stay in the global game. Now, did the message really resonate? Both in France and the United States, the political landscape is currently in the throes of major upheaval, blowing away the classic left versus right divide as nativists take on globalists. The upheaval could redefine much more than just partisan fault lines. Representative democracy itself is changing, with a U.S. president whose bully pulpit is Twitter, and a French one who seized upon voters' desire for strong leadership last year to run what he has called a Jupiter-like presidency. Today, in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Macron in America, and with us from Washington, Benjamin Haddad, fellow at the Hudson Institute. Nice to see you.
Hi, good to see you.
From New York, John Rick MacArthur, publisher of Harper's Magazine. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Gérald Olivier, editor of France Amérique, the France Amérique blog, and columnist for Atlantico.fr.
Good evening.
Welcome back, sir. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Yours is the country that invented multilateralism. Emmanuel Macron urging the United States to resist the temptation of isolationism.
The only option then is to strengthen our cooperation. We can build the 21st century world order based on a new breed of multilateralism. This requires, more than ever, the United States' involvement, as your role was decisive for creating and safeguarding today's free world. The United States is the one who invented this multilateralism. You are the one now who has to help to preserve and reinvent it.
Benjamin Haddad, will those words resonate?
Well, you know, he is talking at a time, of deep skepticism and doubt here in the United States over the role of the United States on the world stage. He has been trying to make this case over the last couple days, beyond Washington, by the way. It was interesting to see that he decided to be interviewed on Fox News on Sunday, which was a way to reach the Trump base, the voters who have decided to endorse this vision of inward-looking America first. Today, he made the case for cooperation against global challenges like climate change. He was roundly applauded by the Democrats on the Hill for making the case for the Paris Agreement. But he also made the case for staying within the JCPOA, the Iran deal, and having a tough position against Iranian expansion in the region, but in cooperation. This is the same case he's been trying to make to President Trump. It's going to be an uphill battle. We've seen it, you know, obviously it looks very likely that the United States will withdraw from the JCPOA when the President Trump decides not to sign a waiver on sanctions on May 12th. So the question is, what do we do from there? I think this is why they talked yesterday of a new deal, trying to, you know, maybe build upon the existing framework to add a few dimensions. But yeah, it is a fraught time for transatlantic relations, and President Macron has been trying to make a case for unity these last few days.
Yeah, when he says, I'll put it to you, Rick MacArthur, when he says that, we heard at the outset of that clip, we can build a 21st century world order. Who's the we in your view, Rick MacArthur?
Well, if it were a different French president, we would be the United Nations, and all the different international organizations that were created by the United States to try to prevent another world war from taking place. But since it's Macron, it's impossible to know where he's coming from. He's I would say he's in over his head. His vanity has taken over from his judgment, because you can't separate the speech to Congress from the glad-handing and the hugging and kissing of Donald Trump at a time when the United States is menaced, really, internally, by a president of incredible vulgarity and ignorance. He comes to the United States and says, I can make you a better person. That's what he seems to be saying, which is absurd, absolutely absurd. And I'm embarrassed as a dual citizen. I'm a French citizen too. I'm embarrassed for my fellow Frenchmen.
Yeah, but what do you do? Isn't it better to have him hugging and kissing the U.S. president and maybe getting his ear, rather than boycotting him? And you know, Benjamin Haddad was saying a moment ago, better to speak to Fox News, to his base, rather than for each side to stay in their bubble.
Well, he also, there's a middle ground where you use diplomacy and diplomats and international institutions, but he seems to actually believe that Trump will listen to him where Trump won't listen to anybody else, which is the height of vanity, and it's probably counterproductive, because one thing that Trump does fear is social isolation. He does not want to be shunned. And here he's got this sort of pseudo-Frenchman with a little bit of French culture and style and a little bit of knowledge of history, gracing his table, making him look better. I think it's exactly the wrong way to approach Donald Trump in terms of negotiation, if you're serious about trying to get him to play by the international rules, if you're trying to preserve the agreement with Iran. Remember, everything Trump has said up to now about Iran is a provocation. It's a provocation to Iran to say, we're going to tear up the agreement, or we're going to pull out of the agreement unless you enlarge it, right? And so what does Macron do? He comes to the Congress and says, yeah, you know, we should enlarge it. To me, it's crazy. It's anti-diplomacy.
Gérard Olivier?
That's fascinating. The comment by John are as fascinating as what we saw today. To go back to your first question, is it going to resonate? I would say it depends on who he was talking to. I mean, Macron. It did resonate in the Congress. He got plenty of applause, and on certain topics, the climate, multilateralism, obviously he was in agreement with most of the people in that chamber. Did it resonate with Trump? Trump said he was going to watch the speech on TV. I agree with John. I don't think so. And to follow on that comment, the interesting thing is that before that trip, people in France knew that Emmanuel Macron was going to try and change Donald Trump's mind. And was he going to be the skillful person to do it? Or was he going to be the naive guy to try and fail? And history will tell actually how he succeeded or not. We don't know yet. Apparently, he seems to have failed on most of those points. The Iran deal, most probably. And the only disagreement I have with John is that I don't think that Donald Trump ever considered enlarging the deal. That was a way for Emmanuel Macron to save his position. On Fox News on Sunday, he gave an interview and he said, there is no plan B, so you have to stick to plan A. And now, after a meeting with Donald Trump, he comes up with a plan B, which is that whole comprehensive agreement we should be working on, which, by the way, I think simply is dead on arrival, but time would also tell.
That's what the Germans say in any case.
Yeah, and the Iranians too, and they're the first one to be concerned. They're just not going to go into any kind of negotiations in that sense.
Benjamin Haddad, as a Frenchman in Washington, what do you make of the kissing and hugging?
You know, I'll be very frank. What I heard earlier, I think, is a little silly. At the end of the day, this isn't the role of the French people or the French president to choose the president of the United States. The American population made a choice. I know that a lot of people are very upset with this choice, and President Trump here is very divisive and unpopular. But there's no other alternative for leaders in Europe to defend their own interests, to defend their agenda, and to engage as best as they can the President of the United States. The idea that we could live without the US, that we should isolate the President of the United States, is just completely unrealistic. It's a complete denial of the reality of the balance of power. What are we going to do? Continue with the Iran deal without the United States, with the United States withdrawing? Of course we need to make our case. It is a very complicated case. Donald Trump made campaign pledges. He has his own agenda. He has his ideas. He looks mostly at American domestic politics when he's making this decision. This is something that he cared about, that he campaigned on. So of course it's going to be hard for foreign leaders to make their case. But I mean, you know, I've been hearing this a lot actually from Americans here saying, why is he talking to him? Why is he trying to be friendly? Why is he engaging? You know, once again, you can't export American domestic politics to the rest of the world. The rest of the world has to deal with America as it is, not as what, you know, people in New York or Washington would like it to be.
Lots of reactions.
I would.
Go ahead, John Rick MacArthur.
I would dispute that again by pointing out that everything Macron has done up to now with Trump, starting with the invitation to last summer to the 14 Juillet thing, has been an attempt to normalize the Trump presidency, to make him look like he could be a normal president, someone who can be negotiated with. And the most recent example of that is following suit, cooperating with the Syrian strike, the bombing of the alleged Syrian chemical weapons warehouses or depots, where basically he's making an entirely symbolic gesture. He's rubber stamping an entirely symbolic gesture, which leads to nothing and makes France look, rather than an independent, important player with leverage, like a rubber stamp. I mean, we're so far from the French foreign policy of Dominique de Villepin and Jacques Chirac, which wisely opposed the invasion of Iraq. It's frightening. It's quite distressing.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. Just what is Macron playing at with this bow and scrape to Trump tour? If he keeps the Iran nuclear deal viable, it will be a very good thing. Still a strange spectacle by the French leader. Rick MacArthur, on Friday, the German chancellor will be in Washington. She won't get the same reception. Again, I put the question to you. If you want to get through to Trump, is it better to have the Macron or the Merkel approach?
Well, Germany is an independent economic power greater than France now. I mean, Macron is in trouble in Europe, too. He can't even persuade Merkel to ease up a little bit on German fiscal policy in a way that would help France. I mean, he's not in a strong position. Merkel, when she comes to Washington, is a powerful player on the world scene. Germany is a powerful, dominant exporter of industrial products, which is something that Trump said he was going to reverse. He was going to try to reverse the trade deficit and reindustrialize the United States. Macron has no such leverage. He has to resort to this, I would say, misplaced and not very funny comparison between the meeting of Voltaire and Benjamin Franklin and him and Trump. I guess that was supposed to be funny. I didn't think it was funny. I thought it was idiotic.
Jean-Olivier?
Well, where I disagree here...
Maybe an insult, perhaps an insult to Voltaire and to Franklin.
The problem, I can see from what John's saying how unpopular Donald Trump is with some Americans. And anyone who's going to play with Trump then is going to become unpopular by association. I think it's very wrong. Now, talking about Angela Merkel and what's going to happen on Friday, the relationship between the two is radically different. And not just between the two persons, but between the two countries. And it's not so much that Macron doesn't have leverage, but Trump doesn't have anything against France. He does have a lot against Germany. He has a lot against Germany, because of that huge trade deficit they have with them. And to him, trade deficits are a disadvantage. If If we buy more from them that we sell to them, then we get ripped off by them. That's the way Donald Trump sees trade. And so he is very angry at Germany because he doesn't know what to do to reverse it. And he has a bad relationship with Angela Merkel, mainly because of that problem. Other issue, European defense. The US has been paying for German defense for 5 decades. He wants them to pay more, and she is not the type to listen, and she's not the type to move. She doesn't want to please the other people she meets as much as Macron likes to do that. So I'm sure that the meeting they're going to have on Friday is going to be a lot more tense. We won't have the media coverage that this one got, but at least Macron managed to work out a relationship. It doesn't seem to be getting results, but you can't blame him for trying. I quite agree with Mr. Haddad on that point.
Benjamin Haddad, on that point, Emmanuel Macron, do you see him as speaking as president of France in that speech or as president of Europe?
Well, I mean, first, as president of France, obviously he's here to defend the long-standing relationship between the two countries. I mean, you know, the issues like cooperation on terrorism is excellent, whether it's American support for the French operation against Al-Qaeda in the Sahel or the cooperation, the coalition against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. But yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, he is trying to make the case also on more global challenges that concern the European Union. You know, he made an impassioned case for multilateralism. He's trying to salvage what he can of the Iran deal. He's trying also to, you know, make the case on climate change. And I would say on climate change, it's not only about convincing Trump and the administration, but it's also about building coalitions beyond Washington, beyond the Beltway, like what's being done in the last few months with governors and mayors and corporations, and trying to build, you know, a coalition that circumvents the federal government. But once again, let me come back. I mean, I really want to insist on this. The idea that foreign leaders are normalizing Trump by engaging him, I think, is a complete misunderstanding of the way the rest of the world see this situation. If Americans don't want foreign leaders to engage with Donald Trump, they should vote for someone else. You know, and I'm sure a lot of European leaders would be very happy to have to deal with some other American president. But you know, right now, it's just an appreciation of reality. It's not about normalizing, you know, and I think, once again, this is something I hear a lot. So, but I think it's a complete denial of the situation, of the way the rest of the world has to deal with the reality of the United States. And, you know, yeah, okay, I work in a think tank in Washington, you work in a magazine in New York. Maybe, you know, in Washington, Hillary Clinton got 94%. But when you get out of the country, there's still a lot of people who voted for Trump, who are skeptical of America's international role, are skeptical of the fight against climate change, who are skeptical of international alliances. So you need to make that case. And I would argue that on certain areas it's been rather successful, because you have a President Trump who campaigned on a very anti-European, anti-NATO platform. And we've brought him to engage the Europeans to, for the moment, hold the line on Russia sanctions, engage NATO. You know, we're far from the NATO is obsolete rhetoric of the campaign.
Right, we're gonna Benjamin, I'm gonna have to interrupt you.
We've made progress.
We're gonna have to interrupt you because we have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back to continue the discussion. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at Emmanuel Macron's approach to Donald Trump and his conception of what democracy is. As he made a speech before a joint session of Congress on the final day of his state visit to Washington. We're talking about it from Washington, Benjamin Haddad, fellow at the Hudson Institute, a think tank from New York. He's the publisher of Harper's, John Rick MacArthur, and here in the studio, columnist for Atlantico.fr and the editor of the France Amérique blog, Gérald Olivier. Welcome back to all three of you. During that speech by Macron, the applause clearly consigned to one side of the aisle when the French president addressed the environment, making his pitch for Donald Trump to reconsider his decision to walk away from the Paris climate change agreement.
By polluting the oceans, not mitigating CO2 emissions, and destroying our biodiversity, we are killing our planet. let us face it, there is no planet B.
No planet B. I don't know how he did on puns in English, but you know, I guess it sticks in your mind.
That was fine. I think that's becoming common currency to say there's no planet B. In other words, if we wreck planet A, there's no planet B to run to.
That's what he had already said about after the U.S. led the Paris Accord.
And just picking up
I'll
on something you said.
In defense of Macron.
And something else to say in defense of Macron. John Rick MacArthur, in part one. Part one of the discussion, you were saying how perhaps it's a little too much that kowtowing to Donald Trump won't get you very far. In that speech, he nonetheless didn't just bring up the encounter between Voltaire and Benjamin Franklin. He mentioned African-American writers like James Baldwin and Richard Wright. He mentioned Simone de Beauvoir. He also, in that speech, his references were at times to people who were embraced a view of the planet that was that is not that of the current occupant of the White House.
Yes, he brings a little bit of class, as we say in the United States, to the discussion. He is, after all, married to a French literature teacher. Wasn't she? Didn't she teach French literature
and theater
at his lycée and theater? So that's nice. But you're speaking to a guy who is so ignorant of anything remotely resembling what a typical French intellectual or even a middle class or a working class Frenchman or Frenchwoman would be interested in, that I'm sort of appalled. And by the way, I have to make a correction here. My friend in Washington is trying to paint me as a member of the coastal elite pro-Clinton cabal. I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. I didn't vote for Trump. And I think a lot of what Trump says accidentally hits the mark. And that's another area of contradiction. Macron is a famously liberal, in the economic sense, politician. He's for free trade. He's for no tariffs. He's for the free market, and so on and so forth. And Trump's constituency, the reason he's president is because of these so-called free trade deals, NAFTA and permanent normal trade relations with China. Macron is not addressing those people when he starts going on and on about multilateralism. If he wants to address those people in Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, and in the northeast of France, he should be saying, I feel your pain. We're going to try to do something and get you back to work.
However, in the speech, when he talked about trade, he did say that he was in favor of free and fair trade. And he used the word fair for a very specific reason, because that's the word that also Donald Trump uses all the time. And I think there's got to be a distinction to be made between simple protectionism and this idea that a completely free market in a world with such inequalities as ours cannot necessarily work. And beyond the renegotiations of NAFTA, beyond all kinds of talk to China, there is that sense that we can maybe make trade still free, but a little more fair, and this time not so much in favor of the other guy, but in favor of the West in general, not just the U.S., by the way.
And let's pick up on that point, because listen to the U.S. president. During their joint press conference on Tuesday, Donald Trump was asked about this brewing trade war over aluminum and steel. Here's what he had to say.
The trade with France is complicated because we have the European Union. I would rather deal just with France. The Union is very tough for us. They have trade barriers that are unacceptable. Our farmers can't send their product into the European Union easily as they should, and we accept their product, so we have to make a change.
I'd rather just deal with France, Benjamin Haddad.
Yeah, this is something that President Trump has said repeatedly. He doesn't seem really to understand how, well, now he understands it, but apparently when the first time he met with Chancellor Merkel, he kept on repeating that he wanted to have a trade deal with Germany, and she had to tell him something like 10 times that you had to deal with the European Union. I think the fact that Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel are coming the same week is important in terms of coordination of message, especially on this question of trade. We managed, I think, to postpone this question of tariffs until May, so a new decision has to be made. Obviously, this is a very counterproductive measure taken by President Trump. It'll have political repercussions because it's obviously unhelpful to the transatlantic relation. But a vast majority of economists also agree that that putting tariffs doesn't help your account balance. These are mostly fixes that have to be made to the American economy, whether it is towards European Union and Germany or towards China.
Yeah, we saw that there again the applause was partisan when Emmanuel Macron spoke about trade during the speech. The applause seemed unanimous though when he talked about the fight against fake news, and it reminds us that we are going through different times where politics have gone global. In 1835, one of France's greatest political scientists published his account of, I guess you could call it the ultimate road trip, Alexis de Tocqueville's of democracy in America, shows up the stark contrast between the heavily centralized monarchies of Europe and the bottom-up governance of a new nation. And he said at one point in that book, men who so uneasily tolerate superiors patiently suffer a master and show themselves proud and servile at the same time. It got me wondering, Gérard Olivier, what Tocqueville would make of Macron and Trump and who that remark would be referring to. Because again, at the time, they were obsessed with tyrants.
Yes, they were. And I wonder what Tocqueville would make of America today, which is definitely not the kind of America he visited back in the early 19th century. But to go back to the fake news issue, what struck me during the speech by Macron is that he raised that point right after having talked about the climate and how we had to fight to make our planet great again because there was no planet B, et cetera, et cetera. And he mentioned afterwards we have to fight against fake news because it breeds irrational fears. Well, if you talk to the climate skeptic or to the climate deniers, whatever name you give them, they consider that a lot of what you hear about the climate is specifically fake news and fake science. And so I thought that it was not the most à droite, not the most artful way for Macron to put his point forward, because his second point was undermining his first.
And John Rick MacArthur, at one point, he said he got a big round of applause from one side of the aisle when he stated what seems obvious to us here in Europe, that if you want to fight disease, you need medicine.
Right. Well, Trump again is probably the worst example of I mean, he sets the worst example of any president we've ever had in terms of public health, nutrition, the environment, anything that we would consider to be connected to the well-being and health of the general population. If he was trying to be ironic, maybe that's fun for him. But I don't think in this context it's very funny, because we are in a real crisis in the United States. And I don't think the French, I said half jokingly to somebody before I came on the show that he's aiding and abetting Trump's re-election campaign. Trump is in full re-election mode right now. And it's almost as bad as Russian interference in the last election, because this is not a rational man. If he went and if he sent diplomats to have meetings with senators or congressmen or the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that would be terrific. Now, it would be a better way to approach the United States than by trying to have direct talks with Trump. I will say one thing in Macron's defense, however, and that is that, as my two colleagues know, Trump is in the process of eviscerating the State Department. He's not filling any appointments, and he's firing career officers who actually know something about the great issues of the day. So maybe Macron says to himself, well, there is no diplomatic channel anymore, so I have to go see him one-on-one.
So what
That
would
is an
Tocqueville,
argument.
what
That
would
is an argument.
Tocqueville, John MacArthur, what would Tocqueville make of today's United States?
Well, I think he'd say that it's still a very conformist country. One thing that people miss about Tocqueville, I've read him in the entire book in French and in English, is that the United States, you can say whatever you want, you can be a dissenter and so on, but if you are a real dissenter, you're very quickly marginalized, and that this country has a deeply conformist streak. That is not at all in the spirit of dissent and democracy. And I think, this is something people don't talk about when they talk about Tocqueville. He was a very astute observer of certain things about the United States. He exaggerated the fluidity of American society. He thought anybody could get rich. It's not true. Most of the people he met on his trip had inherited money, and who he promoted as self-made people. They were mostly people who already had inherited money, which is still the case in this country. We're still very much a class-stratified, more and more a class-stratified country.
Benjamin Haddad, the last French president to address a joint session of Congress, gave a positively Atlanta speech. It was a very long time ago. It was 2007. His name was Nicolas Sarkozy. He espoused his country's return to the full command of NATO and cheering on globalization during that speech. In fact, at one point during the speech, he said that my country has enormous assets while respecting its unique identity. I want to put it into a position to win all the battles of globalization. Not sure, Benjamin, that Nicolas Sarkozy would still be saying that today.
I don't know what he would be saying, but I think, yeah, this actually started a warming up of the relation between the two countries in 2007. As you mentioned, France decided at the time to join NATO's military command. I think the fact that France was not involved, opposed the Iraq war in 2003, made it easier also for France to intervene in other areas, such as the Sahel. You know, the French don't have the sort of war fatigue that the Americans and the Brits had, and thus, you know, France emerged as a key military.
But Sarkozy himself,
actor.
who's a conservative, he's no longer an Atlantist. He has his party certainly has turned away from the United States to a large degree.
Well, to a certain extent, I mean, I think it depends, and Sarkozy is not a major political figure anymore, as you know. In France, he has other issues right now that he's confronted to, but it's true that among part of the French right, you have, and European right in general, you have a sort of fascination that has emerged for Russia, for the sort of strongman, illiberal figure that's embodied by Vladimir Putin. This is a sort of message that Emmanuel Macron fought against in his campaign, where most of the candidates he was against, the key candidates, Mélenchon, Le Pen, or Fillon, all had this sort of pro-Russian message that was embodied by President Trump himself during the campaign. You see, you know, this sort of fascination is very close rhetoric, I think, with Donald Trump. And once again, this is one area on which it's important to make our case. Talking diplomats to diplomats, or, you know, military to military is important. I think the bilateral relations is excellent. The intelligence cooperation, for example, between the two countries is excellent. But there are a lot of decisions that are made solely by the President of the United States. You can regret it, but that's the way the institutions are arranged in the United States and in France, for that matter. So from, you know, Paris to the decisions on Iran or trade, this is the decision of the President of the United States. He has his own peculiarity. You know, we talked about trade. He's always had a protectionist streak. He believes in a zero-sum game approach to world economics that, you know, it's very that most economists disagree with. But this is why it's important to continue to engage. I think Russia so far is an issue where, despite the president's rhetoric during the campaign, his praise for Putin or his tweets, so far we've managed to, you know, build coalitions after the Skripal assassination attempt for sanctions, for the expulsion of diplomats. So these are areas where, you know, we could do much, we could go further, but we managed to work with the Trump administration in a more effective way, I think, than we feared during the campaign if we listen to the president's rhetoric.
Gérard Olivier?
Yeah, to go back to Sarkozy, 2007 was a different time. That was before the crash and the Great Recession. That was before globalization got a real bad name, as it has gotten since then. Nicolas Sarkozy was at the start. He just got elected. He went to the US for that state visit 3, 4, 5 months after, I think it was November.
He'd gone that summer on vacation to New Hampshire.
With George Bush, with George W. Bush. Well, when you're the French president, you want to make the American president your friend. You want to make it look like it's your buddy. If only François Hollande didn't seem to care, but every other French president has wanted to be a great friend to the U.S. president. Even François Mitterrand came on a state visit to Reagan, and God knows they didn't agree on much either. But the world was different back in 2007. ISIS was not on the table yet. Terrorism was, but not ISIS. So the relationship has slightly changed. But the fact is that Emmanuel Macron is coming at a time when he's trying to put things back together because nationalism has already gone too far. At the time of Nicolas Sarkozy, it was not really a question.
On the hashtag F24 debate, this reaction, and I'll turn to you, John Rick MacArthur, for your reaction to the reaction. I beg to differ with President Macron in his speech to the U.S. Congress. Nationalism is not the same thing as isolationism and withdrawal, and no one is suggesting closing the door to the world. Maybe France would like to match us in foreign aid, says that viewer. John Rick MacArthur, your thoughts?
Well, I agree with the person who said that. It's a caricature to say that nationalism is automatically anti-internationalist. You can have national interests and have a diplomatic posture that encourages worldwide cooperation. Of course you can. We're in a world of caricatures and oversimplifications now, which are not useful. So I agree with him. I mean, it's not. Macron is again. Remember, he's a liberal. He also wants the free flow of capital across borders, and this is something I don't think. Trump doesn't think very deeply about anything, but mostly he's an opportunist and a salesman. So to say that he's got protectionist instincts is again a caricature. His instinct is to seize the opportunity, seize the opening when he sees it, when he recognizes it, and exploit it.
One final question for you on that. During his speech, I couldn't help watch. Behind, you've got Emmanuel Macron making his speech. Behind him is the Speaker of the House. His name is Paul Ryan. He's not running for re-election. And the President of the Senate, who's the Vice President, Mike Pence. And when I see that among the reasons Ryan isn't running is that, well, the Republican Party has changed a lot. You've got this French president speaking after he's just blown up, basically, French politics. Both the left and traditional right are in tatters, and he's been able to build this party in the middle. Do you see in the midterm elections there could be some kind of major upheaval the way we saw in France?
No, I don't think. I'm not even persuaded the Democrats are going to take the majority. It's going to be very close. They might. But I wanted to ask another question of my colleagues here in the spirit of debate and discussion. It's about terrorism. Macron must be conscious of the fact that overthrowing Gaddafi and overthrowing Saddam Hussein led to the development of ISIS and led to instability in Europe because a lot of terrorists were sprung loose by the destruction of those dictatorships, and some of them migrated to France and other places and have been committing terrorist acts. When he talks about solidarity in the fight against terrorism, what does he mean? I don't understand what he means.
Benjamin Haddad, very quickly.
I think it's very clear. It's, for example, the cooperation, the intelligence cooperation, the American logistical, financial support in the Sahel. A few American troops died actually last year fighting terrorism alongside the French in Niger. It's the coalition against ISIS in Syria and Iraq that led to the almost eradication of ISIS. I think it's a fairly obvious point.
But does he want to overthrow Assad? Would he favor the overthrow of Assad?
Not the overthrow.
I don't think he's ever talked about. He actually even made the case it was controversial, but Macron said that there was no, I quote, legitimate successor to Assad. I think you could say that Assad's repression has been one of the main drivers of radicalization and terrorism in Syria, but the strikes of 2 weeks ago were just to respect our red line on the use of chemical weapons against civilians, try to continue to make the use of weapons of mass destruction and chemical weapons as a taboo in international relations. But I don't think there's a lot of political appetite, neither in the United States nor in Europe right now, to get more forcefully involved in a forced transition in Syria.
And just very
briefly, because we're out of time.
Now, one of the things they came to tell Donald Trump was to stay in Syria so that they could build together the post-Bashar al-Assad Syria. That was one of his main points.
But without overthrowing, but we'll discuss Syria in a future show. We're going to have to leave it there.
He views the possibility of okay.
Yeah,
we'll have
he
to views the possibility of it, but it says he doesn't want to do it himself.
Of a post-Assad Syria, yeah.
John Rick MacArthur, many thanks for joining us from New York. I want to thank Benjamin Haddad in Washington and Gérard Olivier for being with us here
pleasure, thank you.
In our studio. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Charlie James.
Hello.
The Macron speech, getting reactions in real time.
Yeah, so a lot of people in America and around the world, of course, watching this, and him speaking in English, I'm sure helped get a larger audience in America.
Not all the comments were flattering when it came to his accent.
There were some, yeah, about his accent. We'll get to that, but first I want to show you some of the reaction from coming out of America. So there was a lot for Democrats to like in this speech, and they were particularly excited by some of the themes that he hit on. BuzzFeed's Hayes Brown saying Macron's speech to Congress sounds like if Obama had been born in France, in my opinion. Our own Philip Crowther saying Democrats haven't had this much fun in House chamber since Obama addressed Congress. And the New Yorker's Susan Glasser saying very likely Macron could win 2020 Democratic presidential nomination, that being a joke, of course, but you can get the sense of how much Democrats enjoyed this. Republicans, it was a little more mixed. I would say the strongest reaction we've seen so far came from Thomas Massey. He is a Republican representative from the state of Kentucky who said French president is a socialist, militarist, globalist, science alarmist, the dark future of the American Democratic Party. So pretty strong there. Not mincing words, but not every Republican was that harsh. Senator from Arizona, Jeff Flake, who has been critical of Trump in the past, but he praised Macron's speech and noticed the stark differences between Trump's America First agenda and what Macron was pushing. Democrats, again, being more excited about this speech. Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, who is a Democrat, saying French President Emmanuel Macron delivered a forceful reminder of the values that tie our nations together, combined with an elegant critique of President Trump's positions on climate change, the Iran deal, and globalization. It was forceful, optimistic, and historic. So historic, lots of glowing praise there. And finally, Representative Jamie Raskin, of a Maryland Democrat, joking, I think Scott Pruitt, head of the Environmental Protection Agency, and Mike Pence, vice president, are going to try to revoke Macron's visa.
Did you find it to be a historic speech?
Historic, not quite, no. But however, it did. I think he was the first French president to actually speak in English in front of the Congress.
Giscard d'Estaing.
He spoke. Oh, see, I was wrong on that one too.
But that was nearly a half century ago.
But Sarkozy spoke in French.
You were very young then.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the lines that got the most attention. That would definitely be online. The climate change parts of his speech, the line "Make our planet great again," as well as the line "There is no planet B," which we've heard here in France him say both of those lines before. And actually, the "Make our planet great again" is the name of one of Macron's climate change initiatives to try to recruit people to France. But for a lot of Americans, this will be the first time that they've ever heard this. And of course, the fact that it's playing off of Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," people like, and also people seeing it as a kind of a rebuke to this bromance that they have been developing over the last few days.
Just very briefly about his English.
Yes, so people impressed with his English. There were some people making comments about his accent a little bit, saying things like they couldn't understand when he tried to say multilateralism, or poking fun at the way that he said matin instead of Martin in Martin Luther King's name. But overall, people impressed. A lot of comments like this saying Macron is more articulate and he's very clearly non-native English than Trump is.
Oh, dear. Charlie James, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.